Speaker.
I call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to speak on the Organised Crime and Anti-Corruption legislation bill. It is a bill that's been some time coming. It was first brought to this House by Judith Collins when she was Minister of Justice. We were told that it would be ready in 2013, but came to us in 2014. But needless to say, this is an area which, of course, is crucial to all parties in this House. It's, I guess, important to us as a nation that we continue to uphold our standing in the international community for doing our bit in this area, and it does require cooperation and collaboration if it's going to function properly. Labor, for instance, recognised that when it set up the Organised and Financial Crime Agency within the police, I believe, in 2008. But it's not just about reputational issues abroad. Obviously, making sure that we keep our own house in order is incredibly important. And I just wanted to use these introductory comments as an opportunity to point out that the Serious Fraud Office is one of the best mechanisms that we have to make sure that we maintain our own domestic high standards when it comes to fraud, bribery and corruption. And that's an organisation that has, in the past few budgets now, sought additional funding to do its job. It warned government, for instance, their concern that there might be additional issues around corruption as a result of the massive amount of infrastructure and rebuild occurring in Christchurch. That was a bid that was declined. Instead, they were left just simply to do presentations around the importance of being vigilant around corruption in Canterbury. And equally, they have warned that they aren't able to prosecute as many cases as potentially they would like to. So it's something I thought prudent to raise, that we do need to make sure we keep our own house in order, even though we are discussing today primarily our international obligations in implementing this legislation. Mr. Speaker, Transparency International is one organisation that does a very good job of keeping in check where New Zealand sits relative to other countries. We have a branch that operates in New Zealand. It's part of a wider reporting regime that takes into account what kind of mechanisms New Zealand is implementing to make sure that we remain a transparent, corruption-free country. We in the past have fared very well. We had a slight slip in the last measure. We're at number 2. No one wants to celebrate becoming second. Denmark picked us at the post, and in part, I believe it's been flagged that the fact that we haven't quite implemented some of these obligations has been part of the reason why. And that's because this is an omnibus bill. It implements proposals including around the all-of-government response to organised crime, which they started back in 2011. But it also aims to improve New Zealand's ability to cooperate with international partners. It ratifies the UN Convention Against Corruption, implements the agreement between the US and New Zealand on enhancing cooperation and preventing and combating crime, and also enhances New Zealand's compliance with a number of other international conventions, including the OECD Convention on Combating Bribery, which I think is something that Transparency International is particularly interested in. There were 20 submissions to this bill. One of the ones, though, the area that I want to focus in on the most, because there are a number of really important points raised, but the area I want to focus in on does sit around a point that the Minister touched on, and that was the facilitation payments exception that exists in this law. Now, Labor overall is supporting this bill. I should point that out. But we do have some reservations around the fact that we do still have a facilitation payments exception in this bill. I thought making reference to some of the, a bit of the background on this would be useful for the House, and also the submissions that were made against it. So New Zealand's foreign bribery offence contains, as the Minister said, a very narrow exception for small payments to be made to foreign public officials for the sole or primary purpose of ensuring or expediting the performance of a, quote, routine government action. Now, these aren't, for instance, the kinds of things that you might pay as part of tariffs or as part of customs duty or anything like that. These are direct payments to government officials or public officials to help facilitate and expedite a particular activity. And I think we should be very clear that in making this payment, you're expediting yourself over and above someone else who hasn't made that payment. I think that's clear in the way it's described. The exception, though, states that for such a payment to be lawful in New Zealand law, it must be small. I'd be interested to hear from members of the committee whether or not there was a discussion over what the definition of small was. Was it relevant? Was it relative to the payment, what the payment was being made for? Was it sized in any way? Will you make a bigger exception around what small is depending on the size of the country or the activity? It must be small for an action within the scope of the official's ordinary duties. So obviously if you're paying a port inspector, it has to be around port issues, and not involve a decision about awarding new business or continuing existing business. So it's about facilitating business that would otherwise occur. Examples of facilitation payments include small payments relating to the grant of a permit or licence, the provision of utility services, or loading or unloading of cargo. Again, it would be really useful for the House, I think, if members, I believe the Honourable Phil Goff was on the Select Committee, perhaps he could share with us some of the examples that might have been raised at committee, because I do think that it's a fine line. It's a fine line, and who is making the judgment over what's routine, what's small, and where you make where you decide there's a difference between either Jonathan Young has a contribution he hopefully will make in the House, or he's talking to himself, I'm not sure, but hopefully at some point he might make a contribution and talk me through some of the way that was discussed by the committee. Now, there were a number of submissions, I believe 3 that were quite explicit about this point in the bill and had concerns about it, including, I believe, the Human Rights Commission and Transparency International New Zealand. Apparently, these submissions were fairly similar in the concerns that they raised. Their points were these, and I think they're good points, so I want to reiterate them and highlight them in this House. Their points were that such payments are bribes regardless of their size. If they're not something that is applied universally and equally to all applicants, then how is it not considered a bribe? The conventions which we are party to do not distinguish between facilitation payments and bribes. And therefore there was a concern that by having this exception, we might actually fall foul of the conventions we are trying to make sure that we're ratifying in this law. Also, thirdly, that the OECD and the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation also encourage businesses to eliminate the use of such payments. Now, I noticed that the Minister, in her speech, said that these kind of payments exist in comparable countries to us, Australia and the United States, she referenced. They don't exist in the UK. They have explicitly ruled out being able to use exemptions like this, and obviously for good reason. Now, in the response from the ministry, they've said that they don't believe the exception is likely to fall foul of the conventions. How do we know? Were we able to seek advice beyond our ministry officials on whether or not we would actually fall foul of those conventions by having this exception? And the ministry also raised that in the UK, they've made the point that for small payments, they're unlikely to prosecute. It's a very big difference to say you're not going to prosecute small payments versus creating an exemption in law that explicitly says you can do it. One is much more permissive than the other. So I do think that there are still considerable questions to be answered about this part of the bill, which really does otherwise let down what I think is a very useful bill and one which we should all be supporting, not only for our international reputation, but also to make sure we spread best practice domestically as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.